Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the sealed letter against her worn dress. Rain soaked through her thin shawl and dripped down her face, mixing with tears she refused to let fall. Her stepmother's voice still rang in her ears. "You're nothing but a burden, girl, 23 years old and unmarried. No man wants a plain thing like you." The words cut deeper than any blade. Margaret had heard them every day for 5 years, ever since her father died and left her at the mercy of his new wife. She looked up at Ashford Castle rising before her like a mountain of grey stone. The Duke of Ashford lived there alone and feared by everyone in the village. Her stepmother had thrust this letter into her hands that morning with a cruel smile. "Deliver this to the Duke himself. No servant, perhaps he'll take pity on your ugly face." Margaret's stomach twisted with shame. She walked through the village carrying that letter, and everyone stared. The baker's wife whispered to her daughter. The blacksmith shook his head. They all knew what she was, the unwanted stepdaughter. The burden, the girl too plain and too poor for any decent man. Margaret kept her eyes down and her back straight. She had learned long ago not to cry where others could see. Her father had taught her to be strong. She held on to that memory like a candle in the dark. He had loved her once. Someone had loved her, even if she couldn't remember what that felt like anymore. Margaret's life had become a series of small cruelties and large humiliations. She woke before dawn each day to scrub floors her stepmother deliberately dirtied. She cooked meals she wasn't allowed to eat until everyone else had finished. She mended dresses for her 2 stepsisters, while her own clothes grew threadbare and faded. Her stepmother found new ways to remind her of her worthlessness. "Look at your hair, so dull and brown. Look at your figure, thin as a stick. Look at your hands, rough as a servant's." Margaret scrubbed those hands raw every night, but they never seemed clean enough. The village had once known her as Thomas Crawford's beloved daughter. Now they saw her as the unwanted burden in Widow Crawford's house. She had no dowry. Her father's modest estate had gone to his wife, and his wife gave Margaret nothing but hard work and harsh words. The young men who had once smiled at her now looked away. Their mothers told them Margaret Crawford was beneath their notice. A girl with nothing to offer, a girl growing old without prospects. Margaret felt herself disappearing a little more each day, but something inside her refused to break completely. When she walked through the garden behind the house, she still noticed how beautiful the roses were. When she fed the kitchen cat, she still felt warmth at its purring. When she read her father's old books late at night by candlelight, she still felt her mind come alive with stories and ideas. Her stepmother could take away her comfort and her dignity, but she couldn't take away the person Margaret was inside. A person who loved beauty and kindness. A person who believed that somewhere in the world, goodness still existed. The castle gates loomed before her now. Margaret's heart pounded as she rang the bell. A stern butler opened the door and looked down at her with cold eyes. "Tradesmen use the back entrance," he said, his voice cut like ice. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she lifted her chin. "I have a letter for His Grace. I was told to deliver it to him directly." The butler's eyebrows rose. He looked her up and down, taking in her wet dress and worn shoes. For a moment Margaret thought he would laugh at her. Instead he stepped aside. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared into the depths of the castle. Miles Thornton, Duke of Ashford, sat alone in his study, staring at papers he couldn't bring himself to read. He was 30 years old and felt ancient. The weight of his title pressed down on him like a stone. He had inherited everything at 25 when his father died. Suddenly, his mother had followed 6 months later, her heart broken by grief. Miles had loved them both deeply, and their loss had carved out something essential inside him. He had money, land, power, and respect. He had everything except the one thing that mattered. He had no one to share it with. The loneliness ate at him slowly. He walked through rooms meant for families and heard only the echo of his own footsteps. He sat at a dining table built for 20 and ate alone while servants watched in silence. He slept in a bed big enough for two and woke each morning to emptiness. His friends urged him to marry. They paraded their sisters and cousins before him. Beautiful women with practiced smiles and calculating eyes. Women who wanted his title and his fortune. Women who would never see him as anything more than a prize to be won. Miles had stopped attending balls and dinners months ago. He couldn't bear the falseness of it all. The shallow conversations, the ambitious mothers, the pretty faces that meant nothing. He wanted something real, something true. He wanted someone who would see Miles the man, not just the Duke. But that person seemed as distant and impossible as the stars. So he stayed in his castle and told himself it was better to be alone than to be lonely in a loveless marriage. His father's old friend, Lord Pemberton, had been writing to him for weeks, urging him to consider marriage, suggesting suitable ladies. The letters annoyed Miles, but he respected the old man too much to ignore them completely. He knew what people said about him in the village. The cold Duke, the lonely lord, the man too proud to take a wife. Let them think what they wanted. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand what it felt like to have everything and feel like you had nothing at all. A knock at the study door interrupted his dark thoughts. "Yes?" he called out. Jenkins, his butler, entered looking uncomfortable. "Your Grace, there's a young woman here with a letter. She insists on delivering it to you personally." Miles frowned. That was unusual. "What sort of letter?" Jenkins hesitated. "I don't know, Your Grace, but the young woman looks rather distressed." Something in the butler's tone caught Miles's attention. Jenkins was not a man easily moved to sympathy. "Send her in," Miles said. He didn't know why he agreed. Perhaps he was simply bored. Perhaps some part of him was curious about anyone brave enough to demand an audience with the Duke. He would soon discover that this moment would change everything. Margaret followed the butler through halls, so grand she could barely breathe. Paintings of stern ancestors watched her from the walls. Her wet shoes squeaked on polished marble floors. She felt like a muddy stain on something beautiful. The butler stopped before a heavy wooden door and knocked. A deep voice answered from within. "Send her in." The butler opened the door and stepped aside. Margaret's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to walk forward. The Duke of Ashford stood by the window with his back to her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothes that made him look powerful and distant. Margaret's mouth went dry. She had heard stories about him, how cold he was, how cruel, how he turned away visitors and ignored the village. She clutched the letter tighter and tried to remember how to speak. "Your Grace," she whispered. Her voice came out small and frightened. She hated how weak she sounded. He turned to face her, and Margaret's breath caught. She had expected someone old or ugly, someone whose face matched the harsh stories. Instead, she saw a man with dark hair and grey eyes that looked unutterably sad. He was handsome in a stern way, with sharp features and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. But it was his eyes that trapped her. They looked as lonely as she felt. For just a moment, she forgot to be afraid. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was deep and careful, neither warm nor cold. Margaret dropped into an awkward curtsy. Her wet dress clung to her legs, and she nearly lost her balance. She felt her face burn with embarrassment. "Margaret Crawford, Your Grace. I was sent to deliver this letter." She held out the envelope with shaking hands. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took it from her. His fingers brushed hers for just a second. His hands were warm and dry. Hers were cold and wet. He looked at her with those sad grey eyes. "You're soaked through," he said. "Did you walk here in the rain?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. He broke the seal on the letter and read quickly. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise? Anger? She couldn't tell. He read it again, slower this time. Then he looked up at her with an intensity that made her want to step back. "Do you know what this letter says?" he asked quietly. Margaret shook her head. "No, Your Grace, I was only told to deliver it." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was strange. "This letter is from your stepmother. She offers you to me as a bride." The world tilted sideways. Margaret's vision went dark at the edges. She reached out blindly for something to steady herself, and found only air. Then strong hands caught her arms and held her upright. "Easy," the Duke said. His voice was closer now, gentler. "Breathe slowly." Margaret gasped for air and tried to understand what she'd heard. Her stepmother had offered her as a bride, like she was a horse or a piece of furniture. Humiliation crashed over her in waves. Of course, this was the final cruelty. Send the ugly, unwanted stepdaughter to the cold Duke. Let him refuse her. Let her be rejected by the one man who might have been desperate enough to take her. "I didn't know," she whispered. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she couldn't stop them. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll go now." She tried to pull away from his hands, but he held her firmly. Not roughly, but steadily. "Look at me," he said. Margaret forced herself to meet his eyes. She expected mockery or pity. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like understanding. "Your stepmother writes that you're 23 years old, unmarried, and a burden to her household. She suggests that I need a wife and you need a home. She proposes an arrangement beneficial to us both." He paused. "Is any of that untrue?" Margaret wanted to die. Every word was true, and every word was a dagger. "Please," she said, "just let me go." But he didn't release her. Instead, he guided her to a chair by the fireplace and pressed her gently into it. "You're shivering," he said. He crossed to the fireplace and added wood to the flames. Then he poured something from a crystal bottle into a small glass. "Drink this. It will help." He pressed the glass into her cold hands. Margaret took a small sip and coughed. "Brandy." It burned going down but spread warmth through her chest. The Duke pulled another chair close to hers and sat down. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and studied her face. Margaret wanted to hide, but had nowhere to go. "I'm going to ask you something," he said quietly, "and I want you to answer honestly. Can you do that?" Margaret nodded, though she had no idea what he would ask. "Do you want to marry me?" His grey eyes held hers steadily. Margaret's mind raced. What kind of question was that? Want. What did wanting have to do with anything? But he had asked for honesty. She took a shaky breath. "I don't know you, Your Grace." "That's not an answer," he said, but his voice wasn't harsh. "Let me ask differently. If you go home today, what happens to you?" Margaret looked down at her hands gripping the brandy glass. What happened? More years of cruelty, more nights crying herself to sleep, more days of being told she was worthless. Growing older and more desperate until even her stepmother's house was closed to her, the workhouse perhaps, or worse. She looked back at the Duke and saw that he already knew the answer. "If you stay here," he continued carefully, "you would be my wife. You would be the Duchess of Ashford. You would have comfort and safety and respect. I would ask nothing from you except your presence." He paused. "I'm not a warm man. I don't know how to be. But I give you my word that I would never be cruel to you." Margaret stared at him. This couldn't be real. Dukes didn't marry penniless stepdaughters. Handsome lords didn't offer kindness to plain, unwanted girls. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" He stood and walked back to the window. Rain streaked down the glass behind him. "I need a wife," he said quietly. "Society demands it. My advisors insist on it. But I can't bear the thought of marrying someone who wants only my title." He turned to look at her. "You came here not knowing what was in that letter. You offered yourself to humiliation without even knowing it. That takes a kind of courage." He paused. "And when I told you what the letter said, you didn't calculate or scheme. You just wanted to run away. That tells me you're honest. I value honesty more than beauty or breeding, or anything else society prizes." Margaret couldn't breathe properly. This man, this powerful duke, was offering her a life beyond her darkest dreams. But something in his voice made her brave. "You're lonely," she said softly. His eyes snapped to hers. Startled, for a moment she thought she had offended him. Then his expression softened into something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm very lonely." "Are you?" Margaret felt tears well up again. "Yes," she whispered. They looked at each other across the study, two lonely people recognizing something familiar in each other's eyes. "I'm making you an offer," the Duke said. "Stay here and marry me. You'll be safe and cared for. I won't expect love or anything you're not willing to give. We'll simply be two people sharing a home, companions perhaps in time." He crossed to his desk and pulled out paper and ink. "I'll write a settlement that ensures you're provided for always, even if something happens to me. You'll have your own money, your own freedom within these walls." He began writing quickly. "Or you can leave now and I'll never mention this meeting to anyone. The choice is yours and yours alone." Margaret's hands shook as she set down the brandy glass. Her whole life hung in the balance of this moment. Behind her was everything she knew. The cruelty and the pain, yes, but also the familiar, the world she understood. Before her was a stranger, offering kindness. But what if it was a trick? What if he turned cruel once they were married? What if she traded one prison for another? She looked at his bent head as he wrote, the way his shoulders curved slightly forward, the tension in his jaw. He looked as scared as she felt, and suddenly she understood something important. He was taking a risk too, trusting a stranger, hoping for companionship, vulnerable in his own way. "I'll stay," she said. The words came out stronger than she expected. The Duke's hand stilled on the paper. He looked up at her with those sad grey eyes. "Are you certain?" he asked. Margaret thought of the empty years behind her, and the possible warmth ahead. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "I'm certain." He nodded slowly. Something that might have been relief crossed his face. "My name is Miles," he said quietly. "You should probably know your husband's name." Margaret felt a strange flutter in her chest. "Miles," she repeated. It felt foreign and intimate on her tongue. He stood and came toward her. "We'll be married tomorrow," he said. "Is that too soon?" Margaret almost laughed. Too soon? She had nowhere to go and no reason to wait. "Tomorrow is fine," she said. Miles reached out his hand. Margaret looked at it for a moment, then placed her smaller hand in his. His grip was warm and firm. "I promise you won't regret this," he said. His voice held such earnest conviction that Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest. Maybe this was madness. Maybe she would regret everything. But standing in this study, with the rain falling outside and the fire crackling beside her, holding the hand of a lonely duke who had shown her more kindness in an hour than she'd known in years, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt hope. The next day passed in a blur of activity that left Margaret dizzy. Miles had sent for the village vicar and gathered his household staff into the castle's small chapel. Margaret stood in a borrowed dress that actually fit her properly, feeling like she was watching someone else's life. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, had been shocked into silence when Miles explained the situation, but she recovered quickly and took Margaret under her wing with surprising warmth. "His Grace is a good man," she whispered, while helping Margaret prepare. "Lonely as a stone, but good. You'll see." The ceremony was brief and simple. Margaret spoke her vows in a voice that shook only a little. Miles spoke his in a steady tone that gave nothing away. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Miles bent and kissed her forehead gently. It was the first time any man had kissed her for any reason. Margaret felt her face flame red, but there was something sweet in the gesture, something that made her think this might truly be all right. The wedding breakfast was awkward. Miles sat at one end of the long table and Margaret at the other, with empty chairs stretching between them. They ate in near silence, while servants came and went. Margaret kept stealing glances at her husband. The word felt impossible in her mind. He caught her looking once and something that might have been a smile touched his lips. "We'll have to learn how to talk to each other," he said. His voice echoed slightly in the big room. Margaret nodded. "Yes, Your Grace." He frowned slightly. "Miles," he corrected. "Please call me Miles." She tried it again. "Yes, Miles." After breakfast, Miles showed her to her rooms. Margaret had never seen anything so beautiful. The bedroom was decorated in soft blues and creams, with a massive four-poster bed and windows that overlooked gardens she hadn't noticed yesterday. There was a sitting room attached with books and comfortable chairs. "This is yours," Miles said, standing in the doorway. "No one will enter without your permission. Not even me." Margaret turned to look at him. He stood stiffly, as if afraid to come further inside. "You don't have to stay out there," she said softly. "It's your castle." He stepped inside, but kept his distance. "I want you to feel safe here," he said. "After yesterday, after everything, I imagine trust is difficult." Margaret's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. He was trying so hard to be considerate, to give her space and comfort. No one had tried to make her comfortable in 5 years. "Thank you," she whispered. Miles nodded. "I'll be in my study if you need anything. Mrs. Davies will help you settle in." He turned to leave, then paused. "Margaret?" She looked up at him. "I'm glad you stayed," he said quietly. Then he was gone before she could respond. The days that followed developed a strange rhythm. Margaret woke in her beautiful room and could hardly believe where she was. She took breakfast in her sitting room, not ready yet to face the formal dining room alone. Miles left notes for her, little messages delivered by servants. "The library is yours to use whenever you wish. Please order anything you need from the village. You're the Duchess now. They'll send the bills to me. I hope you slept well." Each note was formal and careful, but Margaret treasured them. They were proof this was real. She explored the castle slowly, learning its halls and rooms. The servants watched her with curious but kind eyes. They had loved the old Duke and Duchess. She learned from Mrs. Davies, and they worried about the young Duke rattling around alone in this big house. "He needs someone," the housekeeper said while showing Margaret the china cupboards. "Someone to bring life back to these rooms." Margaret wasn't sure she could be that person, but she tried to be friendly and kind to everyone she met. Miles joined her for dinner each evening. At first, they ate in that same awkward silence, but gradually he began to ask her questions about her father, about the books she liked to read, about what she thought of the castle. Margaret answered carefully at first, afraid of saying something wrong, but Miles listened to her like her words actually mattered. He asked follow-up questions. He seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts. It was intoxicating to be listened to. One evening, about a week after their marriage, Margaret gathered her courage and asked him a question. "Why did you become a duke so young?" Miles's expression darkened. "My father died 5 years ago. A riding accident. My mother followed him 6 months later. I think she died of a broken heart." His voice was flat, but Margaret heard the pain beneath it. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It must have been terribly lonely." He looked up at her, surprised. "Yes," he said. "It was. It still is." Their eyes met across the table. Margaret felt that flutter in her chest again. After that night, something shifted between them. Miles began seeking her out during the day. He would find her in the library and ask if she'd like to walk in the garden. They would stroll the paths together, talking about small things. The weather, the roses, a book she was reading, nothing profound. But Margaret found herself looking forward to these walks more than she wanted to admit. She caught herself watching for him, listening for his footsteps, hoping he would appear. Miles found himself doing the same thing. He would make excuses to leave his study and find Margaret. He told himself it was just being polite, making sure his wife was comfortable, but the truth was more complicated. He liked talking to her. She had a quick mind and a gentle wit. She noticed things. She cared about things. When she smiled, which was happening more often, it transformed her whole face. Miles realized one morning that she wasn't plain at all. She was actually quite lovely. How had he not seen that before? He noticed other things too. The way she was kind to every servant she met. How she read to the housekeeper's young son when the boy fell ill. The small improvements she made to the house without asking, just quietly making things better. She arranged flowers in empty rooms. She opened curtains to let in light. She brought warmth to Ashford Castle without even trying. Miles found himself drawn to that warmth like a man who had been cold for years. One afternoon, Miles found Margaret in the music room. She was sitting at the pianoforte, running her fingers over the keys, but not playing. "Do you play?" he asked from the doorway. She jumped and turned, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh, you startled me." She looked embarrassed. "I used to play. My father taught me, but I haven't touched a piano in years." Miles walked closer. "Why not?" Margaret's expression grew sad. "My stepmother said I played badly. She said it hurt her ears." Miles felt a flash of anger toward the cruel woman who had raised his wife. "Play something for me," he said. Margaret shook her head. "I'll be terrible." "I don't care," Miles said. He sat down on the bench beside her. She looked at him with wide eyes. They were sitting very close. He could smell roses in her hair. "Please," he said softly. Margaret bit her lip, then turned to the keys. She played a simple melody. Hesitant at first, she made a few mistakes and winced. But as she continued, the music grew more confident. It wasn't perfect, but it was sweet and genuine. Miles watched her fingers move over the keys, watched her face soften with concentration. When she finished, she looked at him nervously. "See? Terrible." "No," Miles said. "It was beautiful." He meant it. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to be kind," she whispered. Miles reached out without thinking and caught a tear on his thumb. "I'm not being kind," he said. "I'm being honest. You played beautifully." Margaret stared at him. His hand was still touching her face. They were so close he could count her eyelashes. Something electric seemed to hum in the air between them. Miles pulled back slowly, his heart pounding. "You should play every day," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "This piano has been silent too long." That night, Miles couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed and thought about Margaret sitting beside him on that bench. The way her hair caught the afternoon light, the softness of her skin under his thumb, the trust in her eyes when she looked at him. He was falling for his wife. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This was supposed to be an arrangement, a practical solution to both their problems, but somewhere along the way it had become something more, at least for him. Did she feel it too, or was he alone in this growing attachment? Margaret was having similar thoughts in her own room down the hall. She traced her fingers over her cheek, where Miles had touched her. Her heart had nearly stopped in that moment. She had wanted him to kiss her. The thought shocked her. She had married him for safety, not for love. But something was growing inside her that felt dangerously like love. The way he listened to her, the way he smiled when he thought she wasn't looking, the way he seemed to care about her happiness. Was this what love felt like? This terrifying, wonderful ache. The next morning, Miles was different. More attentive, he held doors for her. He pulled out her chair at breakfast. He found excuses to touch her hand or her shoulder. Margaret felt like she was burning up from the inside. Every brush of his fingers sent sparks through her. She caught Mrs. Davies smiling knowingly. The servants had noticed the change between them. The castle itself seemed to notice. Rooms that had felt cold and empty now felt warm and alive. One evening, Miles asked Margaret to walk with him in the gardens after dinner. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. They walked side by side, closer than they used to walk. "I need to tell you something," Miles said. He sounded nervous. Margaret's heart began to race. "What is it?" Miles stopped walking and turned to face her. He took both her hands in his. "When I asked you to marry me, I told you I wouldn't expect love, that we would simply be companions." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. "I was wrong," Miles said, "or rather I was a fool." Margaret's breath caught. Miles's grey eyes were intense on hers. "I've fallen in love with you, Margaret," he said. His voice was low and earnest. "I don't know when it happened. Perhaps the first day when you looked at me and saw my loneliness. Perhaps yesterday when you played the piano. Perhaps every day in between. But I'm in love with my wife, and I needed you to know." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Miles," she whispered. "I'm not asking for anything," he continued quickly. "If you don't feel the same way, we can continue as we have been. I just couldn't keep it inside anymore." "You fool," Margaret said. Miles's face fell. She rushed on before he could misunderstand. "I love you too. I've been in love with you for days and days. I was just too scared to say it." Joy transformed his face. He looked younger suddenly, happier. "Truly?" he asked. Margaret laughed through her tears. "Truly." Miles pulled her close and wrapped his arms around her. Margaret melted into his embrace. She could hear his heart pounding against her ear. "I was so afraid," he murmured into her hair. "So afraid I was alone in this." "You're not alone," Margaret said. "Never again." Miles pulled back just enough to look at her face. Then, slowly, carefully, he lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was gentle and sweet, and full of promise. Margaret felt like she was coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "I love you," Miles said again, like he was testing the words. Margaret touched his face gently. "I love you too." They stood in the garden as the stars came out above them, holding each other and marveling at how everything had changed. The next few weeks were the happiest of Margaret's life. She and Miles became inseparable. They walked together every day. They ate every meal together, moving her place setting next to his so they could sit close. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. They laughed together, they held hands. Miles kissed her every chance he got, like he was making up for lost time. Margaret bloomed under his love like a flower in sunshine. She wore pretty dresses now. She styled her hair. She smiled constantly. The servants told each other that the Duchess was beautiful, and she was, because she was loved. Miles couldn't believe his good fortune. The woman he had married out of loneliness and convenience had become the center of his world. He found himself planning his days around seeing her. He brought her little gifts. Flowers from the garden, a book he thought she'd like, a ribbon that matched her eyes. He loved watching her face light up with each small surprise. He loved the way she said his name, the way she reached for his hand, the way she looked at him like he had hung the moon. He had been so empty before. Now he was full to overflowing with love. They hosted a small dinner party for Miles's closest friends. Margaret was nervous about meeting society as the new Duchess, but Miles stayed by her side all evening, his hand at her back. He introduced her with such obvious pride that she found her confidence growing. His friends were surprised, but pleased to see Miles so changed. The cold, lonely Duke had become warm and attentive. "Marriage suits you?" his friend Thomas said with a knowing smile. Miles looked at Margaret across the room and smiled. "She suits me," he said simply, but their happiness was too good to last without challenge. One morning, a carriage arrived at the castle unannounced. Margaret was in the library when Mrs. Davies came to find her, looking worried. "Your Grace, your stepmother and stepsisters are here demanding to see you." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She hadn't thought about her stepmother in weeks. Hadn't wanted to. Now the woman was here, invading the safe place Margaret had built. "I'll see them," Margaret said, though her voice shook. Mrs. Davies looked uncertain. "Should I fetch His Grace?" Margaret shook her head. "Not yet. I can handle this." But when she entered the drawing room and saw her stepmother's cold face, Margaret felt like that frightened girl again. Mrs. Crawford looked around the room with calculating eyes. "Well," she said, "you've done quite well for yourself, haven't you, Margaret?" Her tone made it clear she didn't mean it as a compliment. Margaret's stepsisters, Anne and Beatrice, stared at her with obvious envy. The Duke's wife, Anne said. "Who would have thought?" Margaret lifted her chin. "What do you want?" she asked. Her stepmother smiled unpleasantly. "Is that any way to greet your family?" "You're not my family," Margaret said. The words came out stronger than she felt. Mrs. Crawford's eyes narrowed. "I raised you for 5 years after your father died, fed you, clothed you, and this is the thanks I get." Margaret felt old shame trying to rise up, the old voice in her head saying she was ungrateful, worthless. But a newer, stronger voice pushed back. "You made my life miserable," Margaret said quietly. "You took every opportunity to hurt me and diminish me. Now you're here because you want something." Her stepmother's false smile vanished. "The Duke married you based on my letter," she said coldly. "I made this match. You owe me." "I owe you nothing," Margaret said, but her voice wavered. Mrs. Crawford heard the weakness and pounced. "Don't forget who you really are, girl. A plain nobody that I had to sell like livestock. The Duke married you out of pity. Do you really think a man like him could love someone like you?" The words hit like blows. All of Margaret's old insecurities came flooding back. What if her stepmother was right? What if Miles's love was just kindness? What if he would eventually see her clearly and regret his choice? "He loves me," Margaret said, but doubt crept into her voice. "Does he?" Anne said with a cruel laugh. "Or does he just feel sorry for you?" Beatrice joined in. "Everyone knows you trapped him, delivering that letter, crying and playing the victim. You manipulated him." Margaret felt tears burning in her eyes. "That's not true," she whispered. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. Mrs. Crawford stood and moved closer. "Here's what you're going to do," she said. "You're going to convince the Duke to give me the Crawford estate that should have been mine, and you're going to provide dowries for my daughters. Otherwise, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly how this marriage came about. How desperate you were. How pathetic." "No," Margaret said, but her voice was small. Mrs. Crawford leaned in close. "You'll do it," she hissed, "because deep down you know I'm right. You know you don't deserve him, and you're terrified he'll realize it." Margaret wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the old wounds were too deep, the old voices too loud. Maybe she didn't deserve Miles. Maybe this had all been too good to be true. Maybe she should run before he realized his mistake. Miles finished his meeting with his land steward and went to find Margaret. He wanted to tell her about a surprise he was planning, a trip to London so she could see the city and pick out anything she wanted. New dresses, new books, whatever made her happy. He loved spoiling her, loved seeing her jewelry. He was smiling as he walked toward the drawing room, where Mrs. Davies said Margaret had visitors. Then he heard raised voices. One voice he recognized. The others were unfamiliar and harsh. He opened the door and took in the scene instantly. 3 women standing over Margaret, who looked small and frightened. The women turned to look at him. One of them, an older woman with a hard face, smiled falsely. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into an exaggerated curtsy, "I'm Mrs. Crawford, your wife's stepmother." Miles looked past her to Margaret. His wife's face was pale and tears streaked her cheeks. Rage ignited in his chest. "Get out," he said. His voice was cold and absolute. Mrs. Crawford's smile faltered. "Your Grace, surely we can discuss." "I said, get out of my house," Miles interrupted. "Now." The 3 women scurried toward the door, but Miles wasn't finished. "If you ever come near my wife again," he said, "if you ever speak to her or about her, if I even hear that you mentioned her name, I will destroy you. I will see to it that you never receive another invitation to any home, that your daughters never make decent matches, that your name becomes poison in society. Do you understand me?" Mrs. Crawford's face had gone white. She nodded quickly. "Good," Miles said. "Jenkins will escort you out." The butler appeared as if summoned and led the women away. Miles turned to Margaret. She was shaking. He crossed to her in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms. "I'm sorry," he said into her hair. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner." Margaret clung to him. "She said terrible things," she whispered. "She said you only married me out of pity, that I don't deserve you, that you'll realize it eventually." Miles pulled back and cupped her face in his hands. "Look at me," he said firmly. Margaret raised her tear-filled eyes to his. "I love you," Miles said. "Not out of pity, not out of duty. I love you because you're kind and brave and beautiful. Because you make me laugh. Because you've brought life back to this house and to my heart. I love you because I can't imagine my life without you anymore." "But what if she's right?" Margaret whispered. "What if I'm not good enough?" Miles's expression turned fierce. "You are more than good enough. You are everything I never knew I needed. That woman tried to break you, but she failed. You're stronger than she ever understood." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I chose you," he said, "and I would choose you again every day for the rest of my life." Margaret felt the doubt begin to crumble under the force of his certainty. "Promise?" she asked. "I promise," Miles said. "You're my wife, my Duchess, my love. Nothing anyone says will change that." But even Miles's reassurance couldn't completely erase the damage of that visit. Over the next few days, Margaret grew quiet and withdrawn. She stopped playing the piano. She made excuses to avoid social situations. She flinched when Miles reached for her, though she tried to hide it. Miles saw what was happening, and his heart broke. That cruel woman had poisoned something beautiful with her vicious words. He needed to fix this. He needed Margaret to understand, not just with her mind but with her heart, that she was loved and valued and deserving. He found her one evening sitting alone in the garden. She looked so sad that Miles wanted to hunt down her stepmother and make her pay for every tear. Instead, he sat beside Margaret on the bench and took her hand. "This can't continue," he said gently. Margaret looked at him with frightened eyes. "What do you mean?" Miles squeezed her hand. "You're pulling away from me, from happiness. Because you're still hearing that woman's lies in your head." Margaret looked down. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't mean to." Miles lifted her chin. "Then let me prove to you that she was wrong," he said. "Let me show everyone that you're my choice and my love." "How?" Margaret asked. Miles smiled. "Trust me," he said. 3 days later, Miles held a ball at Ashford Castle. He invited everyone, the entire village, the surrounding nobility, all of his friends. Margaret was terrified. "I can't," she said, looking at the beautiful ball gown Miles had commissioned for her. "Everyone will see me. They'll know I don't belong." Miles took both her hands. "They'll see my wife," he said, "the woman I love, the Duchess of Ashford, and they'll see that I'm the luckiest man in England." Margaret wanted to believe him. She let Miles's valet and Mrs. Davies help her prepare. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The dress was pale blue and fit perfectly. Her hair was styled elegantly. She looked like a duchess. Maybe she could do this. The ballroom was full of people when Miles led her down the grand staircase. Every head turned to watch them. Margaret's hand trembled on Miles's arm, but he covered it with his own hand. "Breathe," he whispered. They reached the bottom of the stairs and Miles raised his voice. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said. The crowd quieted. "I wanted to celebrate with all of you, to introduce you properly to my wife Margaret, the Duchess of Ashford." He turned to look at her, and the love in his eyes was so clear that Margaret heard gasps from the crowd. "Some of you may have heard stories about how we met," Miles continued, "about unusual circumstances. Let me tell you the truth." He looked back at the assembled guests. "Margaret came to my door on a terrible rainy day. She was cold and frightened, but she was also brave and honest and kind. I asked her to marry me not because I felt sorry for her, but because I saw in her something I'd been searching for all my life. She brought warmth to my cold castle. She brought joy to my lonely life. She brought love where there had only been emptiness." His voice rang with conviction. "I am the lucky one. I am the one who doesn't deserve her. But she chose me anyway, and I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of that choice." The ballroom was completely silent. Miles turned back to Margaret and went down on one knee. She gasped. "Margaret," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I asked you to marry me once out of loneliness. Let me ask you again now, out of love. Will you be my wife, my partner, my love, for all the days of our lives?" Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, always yes." Miles stood and pulled her into his arms. He kissed her in front of everyone, and the ballroom erupted in applause and cheers. As they danced together later, Margaret felt like she was floating. Everyone had congratulated them. People who had ignored her in the village now treated her with respect and warmth. But more importantly, the doubts that had plagued her were finally gone. Miles loved her, not out of pity or duty, but genuinely and completely. She could see it in his eyes, feel it in his touch, hear it in his voice. She was worthy of love. She was enough. She was exactly where she belonged. The seasons turned, and Margaret and Miles built a life together that surpassed both their dreams. They filled the castle with laughter and love. Margaret played the piano every day, and Miles would stop whatever he was doing to listen. They rode together through the countryside. They read books aloud to each other by the fire. They hosted dinners and parties. They made friends. They were happy in a deep, complete way that neither had imagined possible. One spring morning, Margaret woke feeling strange. Miles noticed immediately. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern creasing his brow. Margaret smiled mysteriously. "I think," she said slowly, "that we should probably prepare one of the nursery rooms." Miles stared at her. Understanding dawned slowly. "Do you mean?" Margaret nodded. "We're going to have a baby." Miles let out a shout of pure joy and swept her into his arms, then immediately set her down gently, as if she might break. "Careful," Margaret laughed. "I'm fine. We're fine." Miles touched her face with such tenderness. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." Margaret leaned into his touch. "Our family." The baby arrived 9 months later, a daughter with her mother's kind eyes and her father's determination. They named her Eleanor, after Miles's mother. Margaret held her daughter and marveled at how much life could change. A year ago she had been a frightened girl delivering a letter in the rain. Now she was a duchess, a wife, a mother, and most importantly she was loved beyond measure. Miles sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, looking at their daughter with awe. "Thank you," he whispered. Margaret looked at him questioningly. "For coming to my castle that day," he said. "For staying, for loving me, for giving me this life." Margaret kissed him softly. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, "for choosing me, for teaching me that I was always worthy of love." They sat together as the sun set outside the window, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them. Two people who had been lonely and broken had found each other and built something beautiful. They had taken an arrangement born of desperation and transformed it into a love story that would last their whole lives long. The years that followed were full and rich. Eleanor grew into a happy, confident girl. 2 more children followed, a son and another daughter. The castle rang with the sound of children's laughter. Margaret became known throughout the county for her kindness and charity. Miles became warmer and more engaged with society, his love for his family evident to all. And every year on the anniversary of the day they met, Miles and Margaret would walk through the garden together and remember the rainy afternoon that changed everything. They would hold hands and marvel at how sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes, how love can bloom in the most unexpected places, how 2 lonely souls can find each other and create something more beautiful than either could have imagined alone. Margaret would look at her husband and remember the sad man by the window who offered her safety and unexpectedly gave her love. Miles would look at his wife and remember the frightened girl who delivered a letter and stayed to deliver his heart from loneliness. Their love story became something of a legend in the village and beyond. The poor girl who became a duchess, the cold duke who learned to love, the marriage that began as an arrangement and became a great romance. Young people would hear the story and dream of their own unexpected happy endings. And Miles and Margaret would smile and tell anyone who asked that sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never planned for. Sometimes going to deliver a letter to a castle means returning as someone's beloved. Sometimes love finds us when we're not even looking for it. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming historical romances. Share it with someone who needs to believe in unexpected love and second chances, because we all deserve to find our own happy ending. Remember, you are worthy of love. You are more than the harsh words spoken over you. And somewhere out there, your own story of transformation and joy is waiting to begin.